when politics is reframed as a cosmic war, because this is what apocalyptic narratives create, and Manichaean narratives create, the foundational mechanism of democracy, which is dialogue, compromise, and peaceful transfer of power, are basically dismantled.
Are Europe's foundation being tested? Insecurity, digitalization, populism, climate change, gender inequality, pandemics, mistrust. 7 disruptive elements are fundamentally challenging our social pact. This is Rethink the Deal, the official podcast from Express 2, the European Union research project dedicated to specifying a more inclusive, democratic and sustainable social contract. Join us as we explore the challenges and solutions shaping Europe's future. As religious rhetoric turns politics into a cosmic war, the boundaries of the people are being redrawn. In this second episode, we ask, how does the populist wave stress our shared social contract? Let's rethink the deal.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast series, which is part of the activities of the Express 2 project, Specify and Protect the EU Social Contract. My name is Rachele Marconi, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, and I will be your host for today's conversation. This podcast is developed within Work Package 5, which is coordinated by the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies and led by Professor Giuseppe Martinico. Our work package focuses on populism as a disruptive factor of the EU social contract. Throughout this series, we will host short conversations with scholars and experts to discuss key themes connected to our research. In recent years, the intersection of law and religion has moved to the forefront of populism studies. This shift occurs as populist movements increasingly reclaim religious symbols, not necessarily as expressions of faith, but as powerful markers of cultural identity and civilizational heritage. By weaponizing religious rhetoric to define the boundaries of the people against perceived others, these movements challenge modern legal frameworks and secular norms, making the expertise of law and religion scholars more vital than ever to understanding our current political landscape. We are delighted to open this first episode with Professor Pasquale Annicchino. Pasquale Annicchino is an associate professor of law at the University of Foggia, Italy, where he teaches global law and religion, as well as ethics and regulation of AI and religious data and privacy. In 2023-2024, he was also visiting professor of law at the Central University, at the Central European University in Vienna, where he taught a course on global law and religion. He has also been an adjunct professor of law at Brigham Young University Reuben Clark Law School and at the St. John University School of Law, and visiting professor of law at FGV in Rio de Janeiro. He has been a member of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief, and upon appointment by the Italian Minister of Interior, he also has been a member for several years of the Italian Council for the Relationships with Islam. So thank you, Professor Annicchino, for being here today. And let me start with the first question. Why do you think apocalyptic narratives have become so influential in American politics today?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the project for hosting this, I think, very timely conversation. The question that you raise is key because for us as European, it's a little bit of an American import-export, depends from the perspective you look at it. I think that apocalyptic narrative have shifted from the fringes to the mainstream because they have been successfully institutionalized by influential cultural, political, legal, and theological networks. And I think that if you look at the research, which is now growing very rapidly on this topic, the research identifies, I would say, 3 main drivers. The first is what we can call theological integration. Figures like Charlie Kirk, organizations like Turning Point Faith, integrated the so-called Seven Mountain Theology. This theology mandates that believers should conquer cultural spheres like government and media into secular politics. So it's a way of re-hegemonizing society, to use Gramscian language. The second point I see is what we can call the urgency of now. The narrative tries on a specific perception of time where the time is forever just running out, and the nation faces an immediate existential threat or expiration date, we can say. Therefore, we face messianic times that create a permanent state of emergency, if you want to use the language of public law, and this permanent state of emergency bypasses normal political deliberation with all the consequences that stem from this. And then there is, I would say, a third variable or element, which is the institutional endorsement. Apocalyptic narratives is no longer just outsider agitation. It is endorsed by state power. For instance, the rebranding in the United States of the Department of Defense to the Department of War and the use of other kind of language like this signals that the state itself has adopted a stance of spiritual welfare. So if you combine theological integration, the urgency of now, and institutional endorsement, and you add to this the successful institutionalization by political, theological, cultural, legal networks, you can explain why apocalyptic narratives have become so influential in American politics today.
And let's focus now on the role of technology. How has technology, especially social media and AI, changed the way these narratives spread and shape public opinion?
Yes, I mean, this is another not immediate connection that you would draw, but is key. So, technology, as in many other spheres of society, politics, and law, has fundamentally altered the speed and emotional depth of apocalyptic narratives by allowing for what we can define digital necropolitics or algorithmic polarization. For instance, if you look what happened with the homicide of Charlie Kirk, artificial intelligence technologies were able to, we can say, in theological terms, resurrect Charlie Kirk, transforming him from a deceased activist into an immortal digital Lazarus, if you want to use this metaphor. And this has prevented and prevents the political movement from cooling down, as the martyr can continue to generate content and mobilize followers indefinitely, transforming grief into content. So there is, first of all, this element of digital duplication, let's say, of characters, figures, images, and so on. And then algorithmic polarization, which is a widely studied topic in public law and populism. And we all know the role that digital platforms have had in the polarization of societies. So social media algorithms, as we know, prioritize Manichaean narratives, absolute God versus absolute evil, absolute good versus absolute evil. And because they generate intense affective responses. This generation of intense affective responses is at the core of the social media business. So you move from a supposed rational discussion into a deeply emotional environment. And this technological structure, therefore, rewards the most extreme apocalyptic framing. This is strongly connected to the first question that we have analyzed before. So, and for instance, technologies like deepfake technology allows for the rapid dehumanization of the political opponents. So technologies like deepfake, which can be utilized to dehumanize political opponents, of course, thrive into an intensive emotional environment. So the diffusion, deployment of digital technologies for these purposes is key because they foster polarization, which is the basis, we can say, of the current social contract in a sense. So these kind of technologies are fully embedded into this narrative and context.
Well, we started the conversation speaking about the apocalyptic narratives in the US. But do you think that this phenomenon is something uniquely as American, or is it starting to influence other countries as well?
Now, this would require, very deep analysis. To put it simply, if we can, with some oversimplification, first of all, we have to take into account the differences which are there. For instance, if we compare the US and Europe vis-a-vis the role of religion in public square, that is, of course, very different. The way in which you can also, for instance, weaponize a religion in the public square. If you know the context, it's much easier to weaponize religion in the public square in the US as compared to Europe. Even though we must say that depends which kind of religion you are looking to weaponize. Because probably if you're looking to weaponize anti-Muslim discourses, then it's still easier to weaponize anti-Muslim discourses in Europe than in the US, because the contexts are, of course, different. So you also always have to be contextual. Let's see in detail what we are looking to analyze. In terms of apocalyptic narrative, which is the core business for our conversation, of course, apocalyptic narratives have been much more easier to detect in the US than in Europe. US, to that extent, acts as an hub for the invention, diffusion, and mainstreaming of apocalyptic narrative. But the phenomenon is not uniquely American, and it is actively influencing global discourse through what we can define a feedback loop between the US, Europe, populist movements. Now, first of all, there is an issue of transnational validation, we can say. So European leaders, for instance, have utilized the assassination of Charlie Kirk to validate their own domestic narratives. And we have seen this on a wider scale in the European scenario. Countries which had nothing to do with the political argument that Charlie Kirk and his organization were raising, because they were very much close to American internal debate on American foreign policy, just took the emotional moment of the Charlie Kirk assassination to, push their own political narratives into their own. This was because the event was framed as a proof of global persecution, we can say, against some movements. And then there is also a kind of institutional mimicry. So we have seen, for instance, that the influence has been also visible in European institutions. For instance, Charlie Kirk has been nominated for the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. And so there has been, as always happened in politics, a strategic effort by several actors, to import and reframe narratives which were not born in the European context, but were, imported from the US. If we look at how political and also legal narrative diffuse, this is a very common trend. I mean, several of us have studied the influence of American public interest law firms before the European Court of Human Rights, for instance. And a lawyer would ask himself, but why are American law firms litigating cases before the European Court of Human Rights, with lawyers that maybe even also never studied the European public law, European constitutional law? And if you look at the data, you see there has been good research, for instance, by Laura van der Enden, empirical research by Laura van der Enden on this. You can see that the numbers are quite big, 15-20% of submission from, third-party amicus brief before the European Court of Human Rights. And then these arguments are readopted in the European legal conversation. Comparative public constitutional lawyers have for years discussed the issue of judicial dialogue. I have always found more interest this kind of circulation of legal arguments from bottom up and not necessarily the judicial dialogue, because if you look at the circulation of legal arguments from bottom up, you see how some arguments then, first of all, are cultural arguments like apocalyptic narratives, then are stretched into also legal arguments and begin to circulate from bottom up, and then influence also judicial decision making by especially the European Court of Human Rights. I have to say, you can track several decisions starting from what for me and in our field has been one of the most relevant decisions. And one could also say that in that decision there were a beginning of apocalyptic narrative, because if you look at the Lautze decision, which is the famous decision on the crucifix case in Italian public schools, also in some dissenting opinion of the judges, you could frame those dissenting opinion as quasi-apocalyptic in a sense that if you decide that the crucifix cannot stand there, that's a kind of cultural apocalypse. And so I find this kind of circulation, which is not driven top down but bottom up, very fascinating in a sense, because it does not react to a command and control theory, but can show you, if you are able to trick and analyze it properly, to see how society develops from a cultural, political, and legal point of view.
Now moving to the last question. So what are the biggest risks for democracy when politics turns into a battle between good and evil?
Well, that's, in any case would have been the final question, I would say, because the battle between good and evil, in any kind of, in religious or in political terms, is always the final question, and is always the most important question, which has also, I think, very important legal consequences. Now, when politics is reframed as a cosmic war, because this is what apocalyptic narratives create, and Manichaean narratives create. So when political confrontation is reframed as a cosmic war, I think that the foundational mechanism of democracy, which is dialogue, compromise, and peaceful transfer of power, are basically dismantled. For instance, try to analyze the event of January 6th, transition of power in the US through this angle and through the diffusion of apocalyptic narratives, and I think you will find very interesting insight into that analysis. And I think that these are the three elements that probably also, especially from a legal angle, we should look at in terms of consequences. So the first, I would say, is the end of compromise. So if the opponent is viewed as evil rather than simply, let's say, politically mistaken, then compromise becomes immoral also in religious terms. And so therefore, the goal of politics shifts to political extinction of the enemy, not to confrontation anymore or to winning an election, but you want political extinction of the enemy if compromise and dialogue are not possible anymore. And again, look at some facts which are happening today. Political extinction means violence and means not necessarily the legitimate authority of the state that use violence as a monopoly, but also means societal and political violence widespread in society. We would need another podcast to analyze the issue of violence in US politics and weapons, but probably you will do it in another session. Then, after the end of compromise, I would say that the second element is erosion of neutrality. So, apocalyptic style justifies, because also the immorality of the thing, purging of neutral experts from the government. And we have seen this. Now, we have look at the recent debate that there has been between the chair of the Fed in the US and the US government and so on. And we have seen also executive orders which have stripped civil service protection from thousands of federal employees. And, we have seen benefits to those that can ensure loyalty to the government and so on. Many examples of this. In theoretical terms, I think that we can define this the end of neutrality, which is a direct consequence of this kind of diffusion of apocalyptic framework and not only narrative. And then the third thing which I see, which is a perennial element of any legal theoretical discussion in public law, I would say, is what we can call the suspension of law. So the extreme framing of the crisis normalize the rhetoric regarding the suspension of the Constitution and implementation of martial law style contingencies, as constitutional norms are seen as an obstacle to survival in the face of an existential threat. If you are facing evil and you want to survive, then you can suspend constitutional guarantees. Because if you are dead, what do you do with the Constitution if you are dead? So these are the three elements which I see as the most problematic as far as apocalyptic narratives becomes an intellectual framing that then becomes a political framing, that then from a political framing has direct legal consequences, because these are the three steps that we have to look at. And the consequences are, let me repeat them, the end of compromise, the erosion of neutrality, and the issue with the suspension of constitution, martial law. We have seen in these days Donald Trump invoking the Insurrection Act and so on. The trend, I mean, it's really there. And I think that if we as a law religion scholar can contribute to this conversation is through a way that, looks, first of all, how religion contributes as a place in society, but also how some legal ideas get religionized and then have an impact on society and on the legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you really very much, Professor Annicchino, for this conversation today, which actually raised so many even other questions about the apocalyptic narratives. And thank you also all for following us, and see you to our next Express 2 Project podcast.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Rethink the Deal. We hope our insights on the challenges facing the EU social contract inspire you to join the debate. To ensure you never miss our next discussion, please subscribe and follow the Express 2 Project online. This podcast series is part of the Express 2 research project, funded by the Horizon Europe program.